go?
I think so, yeah.
Ah, awesome stuff. Yeah, so this session is called 5 Things You Need to Know About React But Are Too Busy to Ask. So you said I don't need any introduction, but I'm pretty sure there are people probably watching who've got no idea who I am. So, but really, it's kind of weird doing these virtual sessions. I have to say, I'm sort of so much used to doing these things in person, right? So come on, let's see in the chat. Let's hear a yes, Scott, in the chat. Are you there? Come on, let's hear yes, Scott. And if I look at the chat, maybe get some responses going here. Can I get a yes, Scott? Yes, I've got someone here. Is that Daryl? Is that Daryl? Yeah, look at all these yeses. There's people out there. I'm not alone in my office. This feels good. This feels good. Oh, you guys, I'm feeling the love now. This is good. Because the thing is, right? I put this thing out on Twitter, and I said, so do I write all the code in my session from scratch or just pre-canned stuff? And the results are in. Although it does say 49 minutes left, but there we go. I'll ignore that. But 69% of you wanted me to do live coding. So I'll be doing that. There's 30% want pre-can. So maybe I'll just sneak a little bit of 30% of pre-can code in. Am I going to be able to do that? So since I've got your attention in the chat, if I write in here, PCF, okay, if you like that, if you've done some PCF, so put a little thumbs up on that if you've done PCF development. So just kind of get like a, because I can't do it like a hands up, right? Because, there's no one, I can't see you. That would be amazing though, if Teams like supported like 100 people or something all on the screen at the same time. That would be awesome. Yeah, so, and my watch is going crazy as well, which is, and also, if I type in React into the chat there, if you can thumbs that up or put a heart or whatever, if you've done React development, so I can kind of just get like an idea of how many are out there, because this session is like really about React, but the thing is that when you're working with code, you've got all these things to choose from. There's so many libraries out there to choose from. So you start with PCF, and so I've seen people like bundle in to React, and you just got to get stuff done because you've got deadlines, right? And so sometimes you don't actually have time to go back and just look at things under the covers. So this session is all about trying to kind of give you some little bit of back to basics, and some things that you might not have done, you might not have seen in React. So at the end of the session, hopefully you'll get a little bit more clearer understanding of what's going on under the covers. But quickly, just a quick word. If anyone's seen Sparkle XRM, which is like circa 2011, I mean, this is stuff I started a long time ago, and I've been updating it over the years. But really, the idea around that was, well, we're writing HTML web resources, and most of the time you're kind of starting from scratch, and it was the same issue. There's so many libraries, jQuery this and all these different things, Vue and Knockout and Angular. So what I tried to do is like create a sort of like a set of libraries that work well together, and a set of components that you could do grids and all the form elements and all those kind of things. But we moved on. So where's this going, and what's the future of this? So really, the future of Sparkle XRM is going to be where we were using jQuery before. We're using React now. And so if you're not using React, really the writing's on the wall. Resistance is futile. Insert other anecdote thing here, because really Power Apps is written in React. So that is where not going to go away. And the reason I chose the libraries that I did originally with Sparkle XRM was because I looked at the libraries that were being used in Dynamics as it was back then. And so I kind of match it. And so it's exactly the same thing. And so we use jQuery UI, which fits for a lot of the interactive stuff. And so Fluent UI, which is Microsoft's user interface control library, again, that is used by Power Apps. So you can make user interface look exactly the same as Power Apps because Power Apps is using Fluent UI. So, you know, it's basically the same thing. So Knockout was what I used before for data binding, and now I'll use MobX. So this is the kind of the library future of where Sparkle XRM has gone. I've got a few open source stuff out there in GitHub, which is sort of filling in the gaps that's not provided by those three libraries. So there's like CDSify for early bound type generation, PCF React for creating like a library to make it a lot easier for you to generate React. So that's just a quick word. So moving on from that. But number one, the first thing, so this is like 5 things. So if I talk too much, or if stuff doesn't go wrong, we probably won't get to 5. You know, just just to let you know. But number one, what's the virtual DOM? That's what we're starting with. So the thing about React, like if you go to the React homepage, what they say is like one of the top things is the virtual DOM. So, you know, if it's big enough to put on the front page for React, it's quite a big deal. But when you're using React on a day-to-day basis, just writing code, you know, whatever you're doing, it may not even sort of feature in what you're thinking about, because it's just what React does. So I thought I'd sort of just provide a little bit of background on that. Now, TSX is what we're going to look at. Now, you know, I could do a load of slides here, but you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to write some code, because that's what Twitter says, right? I've also got my cup of tea, so I can, you know, keep hydrated. Excuse me. So what we're going to use is to do all the kind of the demos and do the you know, to show you these things. I'm going to use npx, which is like npm's the nodes package management command line, but it allows us to run libraries without having to download them first. So we're going to use something called create react app, and I think Andrew's got a session on this later on, but I'm going to call this React 5, and I'm going to give it a template. And so what you can do is you can say template TypeScript. There we go. It should be big enough for you, right? Because okay, right.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think so. We are still looking at the presentation screen and not your coding.
Oh,
UI.
okay. Yeah. Right. Okay. Let me just. That means I'm not. That means I'm sharing. That means I am sharing my my screen, not my PowerPoint, and not my screen, right? Yes. So let me just go back in here, and so let me just stop sharing that. So you should see me really big. Yay! Hello. And now I'm going to go and reshare, but I'm going to share my screen rather than my desktop. Screen 1, screen 2. Okay. So you should now see. Let me know if you can see that. I've got a red line around it, which is always good.
Yep.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah,
good. So I'm going to
can see. Yep. Thank you.
Oh, awesome. Right. So I'm going to use npx create react app, and I'm going to say React 5, and I'm going to give it a template called what am I? TypeScript. Like that. Okay. So that's what it's going to do. Is going to download create react app, which is like just a thing to get you started. But whilst it's doing that, so that probably means you didn't see this up because I wasn't sharing it before. Whilst it's downloading. But whilst it's downloading, the things I've learned on Reddit. So if I search Wikipedia and I say software patch, something I learned on Reddit today was I've known about the bug and everything, but actually software patch is quite interesting. There's a really cool image here of like punch cards. And when there was a bug in the program in punch cards, they put a patch over it so they could repunch it. Isn't that awesome? So a little bit of interesting trivia there. So hopefully it's finished by now. It has. Awesome. See what I did there. Right. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go into it should have created like a folder for that, and you know it's going to put a whole load of stuff in there. And what I'm going to use npm install. And so what that does is it goes and grabs all the packages and then creates an npm lock file, because the create react app uses yarn by default. And then once it's done that, I'm going to go, and what I'm going to do is going to open up code. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add some linting, because what linting does is means that when you're writing code live, on a live stream, it'll kind of highlight stuff and make sure that you don't make mistakes. So it's always a good thing. So yeah, it's just loading all the stuff. Yeah, it takes a lot of time. And the thing is, well, the Create React app has a ton of libraries it has to use, and NPN is amazing. I mean, it's basically like a NuGet that using Visual Studio. So when you kind of do your install modules in Visual Studio, it goes and grabs the NuGet stuff. Well, npm is exactly the same. It goes and grabs all the modules. So there we go. It's done. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to say code dot and open up Visual Studio Code. So there we go. It's all good. So what it's done is it's created like a source folder here, and it's created a whole load. It's basically got a little logo thing. We don't really want all of that. It's created service worker. It's some tests for us. We're not going to show those things. It's got a CSS in there, a test. I'm basically stripping it right back to bare bones, because that's one thing. If you're doing these things, it's always a good idea to actually cut it back to so that you don't get any other stuff complicating what you want to do, because when you're trying to understand what's going on under the covers, you want just the bare bones. So what I do now is I'm going to actually add my linting in. So I'm going to eslint rc.json, and I'm going to I've got a bit of JSON code here, which I'm going to just copy and paste, because I'm not going to type it all in, because this is like this is the 30% I was talking about. There's a whole load of stuff here, but all I'm doing here is just setting up so that my linter is going to show nice code highlighting and show the best practices and tell me when I've written stuff wrong, which I do an awful lot, I have to say. So Prettier RC JSON as well. So Prettier, basically what this is Prettier is a way of making sure that your code is always formatted the same, because when you're checking stuff into Visual Studio, in source code, you don't want to have constant changes in the way in which your code is formatted. You always want it completely consistent. So there we go. So now what I've done is I've just created the config file, but what I also need to do is I need to go and actually install a load more npm modules, installs Prettier, installs the ESLint plugins that allow ESLint to run Prettier. So that once I've done this, I should have the ability. I'm going to restart. It's all good. So I'm going to now say I'm going to restart Visual VS Code, because or reload. I think is it restart. I always forget the reload. There we go. Yeah, that was a real window. Dupe. Good. So now when I come in here, if I say Control Alt Shift, we should now start to get linting highlights. So it kind of starts to be giving me information about what I'm doing wrong. So it's a little bit too big. So I'm just going to shrink it down. So that's all good. Let's also, this is a really brave thing to do, delete the app.tsx. What am I doing here live? This is crazy. And what I'm going to do is go and create a sort of like a top level React component, so that we can, what we're trying to understand here is how rendering works and how this virtual DOM works with React. Because, if you're doing stuff in PCF, there's so many other things that are going to kind of confuse what you're doing. So I'm going to export a class called app, and I'm going to extend the react.component, and I'm not going to give it any props. But I'm not going to give it any state. So you don't actually technically need to give that. But what I can do here is I can say constructor, and I haven't got any props, and I'm just going to give it. This is like the bare bones of a component. Now you need to import, so use Control dot to get these things going in. Control dot is your friend in VS Code if you don't use it already. So that's like the boilerplate. Now, you can omit these, like I said, in the constructor, but I'm just going to put them in there for completeness because we're going to use them in a minute. Spoiler alert. And what we've got is the key thing to a component in React is that it returns a JSX element. So what in the earth is JSX? Well, if you notice, the file type in here is TSX. Well, JSX is effectively the type of JavaScript, the JavaScript equivalent of TSX. So TypeScript X TSX, and it gets transpiled into JSX. And then what happens is the React compiler will actually go and create native JavaScript that doesn't look anything like JSX. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to return a React fragment here, which is just the open bracket. So this kind of looks like, it really sort of looks like HTML. You know, I'm just typing HTML sort of like stuff here. But there's a few notable differences. Like, so I can't type class equal. I can have to type class name. And so what this is doing is it's allowing us to create elements inside the virtual DOM. And then what React does is it actually moves that into the real DOM, the actual browser DOM. So why is it even doing this? Well, the thing is that the browser DOM is actually quite slow. It's not slow at like adding elements, but it's slow at rendering stuff. And so what the virtual DOM does is allows us to kind of have a lot of changes and adding stuff and removing stuff and changing all of the state and props. And then what React does, it goes, okay, well, I'm going to sort of separate the two, and then I'm only going to render the real browser DOM when I really need to. So it kind of minimizes the number of renders. But also, it'll only change stuff when actually things change in the output. So it kind of gives us this sort of little sort of bubble, you know, this little sandbox, or you can create stuff in the virtual DOM, and then React decides actually when we need to do the real rendering. And what this means is actually, if I had something that is, if I go back to my the PowerPoint here, if we had something like here where I say the props, because the props are read-only data that's passed to my component, really important, read-only data, it's props, short for properties. And if I had a little sort of condition here to say, well, if it's less than 3, well, the output, it doesn't even include the span. It just decides not to do anything with it. But then, of course, if the condition is true, then the output, it will have it in the DOM. So React kind of isolates you from that real DOM, and it decides on, unlike something like Java jQuery, which jQuery would like tend to sort of apply some CSS rules to make it hidden and shown. And so those are the kind of things that are actually quite expensive when you come to, you know, do things in the real DOM. So that's the kind of the bare bones of a component. Now I've got no red here, which is always a good sign. So if I say an npm start here, what the Create React app does is gives us like a little local dev server, which is quite nice. And so if you've done PCF development, it's very similar. You know, it kind of oh, look, here we go. It's giving us an error. It says attempted to import app does not contain a default import. Yeah, well, okay, that's important, because if we go into index.tsx, oh, look, I've got lots of nice red lines here. Because look, that's Prettier doing its thing. It's saying, look, okay, replace that with that. I mean, it's saying, okay, I've got a code standard here to say I'm using double quotes rather than single quotes. And what's awesome is I can use Shift, Alt, and P. And look, it magically fixes it. Isn't that so awesome? So the error that it's giving here is it's saying that I have to provide it with the specific, because I wasn't doing a default export. And then it's basically complaining about some stuff that I deleted. So I'm going to get rid of these things that I deleted here. There we go, and get rid of that, because you know when you strip things out, you're bound to break things somewhere. You know, so this index.tsx is really straightforward. It's basically saying, okay, use this React DOM and render something. Now, if you've done PCF development, effectively, this React render is exactly what you see in a PCF document. Now, if you go to the PCF files, the PCF docs, you can see like a React sample code, and it has exactly the same thing. So this is what I love about Create React app, is it's kind of creating us a index.tsx, which is very similar to the index.ts, which is generated by the standard PCF construct templates. So it kind of allows us to test our stuff out without actually being inside PCF. So I'm going to save that away. And look, oh, amazing! I get foo, which is great. So if I do an F12 on this, I don't really want the magnifier up. Okay, so if I go over into sources here and I look at our sources, our static on here. Because the create React app template has kind of got the transpiling and it's got source maps included. The great thing is I can actually see what's going on here. So we can see app.tsx, which is nice, which is just our TypeScript. However, if we look at the actual bundles that it's created a main chunk, a bundle, and one chunk. Now, the reason it splits these up is the way that Create React App works is if you're changing stuff, it separates them off into separate bundles so that it can update them in place without changing any other things, and it separates off the libraries into a separate item. So, you know, if you look at the bundle, it's got a lot of, you know, all of the libraries for React. But if you look in here, and if we search for app, then what you can see here is we've got a class app, and inside the render element, what it's doing is it's using this sort of, you know, create element, and it's got like a fragment and all sorts of weird stuff inside there. So this is what this is. This is the TSX being compiled into or transpiled into just standard JavaScript. So, because we just, you know, trying to crack through a ton of this stuff, let's go and do some other things in here. So I'm going to go into app.tsx here, and I'm going to add in a different, like I'm just going to sort of create like a piece of state here, which allows me to output a number of items. So I'm going to say export interface, and I'm going to say so app state. So this is basically telling me what kind of state do I want to manage by my my application. I'm going to give it an array of items. So I need to define what an item is. So I'm going to go and create a new file, and I say item.ts, and I'm going to say export interface item, and I'm just going to give it an ID, which is going to be a string, and then a title, which is really basic stuff. Okay, and then go back in here and say ding, import item. So what I need to do now is create in my constructor, I need to sort of initialize this thing up. So I say this state equals, and I give it like, so I know that I've got a state of app state. So I'll put that in here because it's the two types here are the props, which are read only, and app state, which is read writable. That's the really important. Props are read only, state is you can change. So if I change the state to app state, now what I should have is this should be typed of types items. So I can say now make an array of items, and I can give it an ID of 1 and a title. I'm going to say power platform. That's item 1. And I'm also going to then give item 2. Okay, ID 2. And I'm going to say title power. Okay, I'm using Control-Shift-P, and it's just reformatting out, which is awesome. So now what I can do in my render function here is I can actually render out a whole ton of those items. So I can say I can use a curly braces here, and what this is doing is basically this is just it's just writing JavaScript. You know, because this is TSX, but it's still JavaScript. It's still TypeScript. So I'm going to say I'm going to use a deconstructor operator here. So items, and I'm going to grab this from this .state because we know that items is in the state. Is it in the state? The item. I can get there. We go. Should be able to bring it up now. There we go. So I've got items now. So just bring that down like that. So what I can do now is I can say I can map these using just a standard JavaScript map function, and I can use that fat arrow to get just a bit of HTML here, which is very similar to you know, you would if you write normal HTML, except for it's this TSX, this React virtual DOM thing going on. So there's a couple of things here which are really important. Well, actually, the one thing really, which is the most important thing, which is the fact that I'm giving it a key. Because the thing about this virtual DOM is that if you are going to move stuff around in an array, okay, because I've got an array of items, say I mutate this, Well, the virtual DOM needs some way of linking it to the non-virtual DOM. And so the way that it does that is that it uses this key. And this is like, so if you don't provide this key, actually my linter will give me a warning to say, look, missing key prop. That is a really good reason why you use a linter. And so what it allow me to do now is, if we go over into my Chrome, you can see it's output the thing here. Now, there's a really awesome thing. If you install the React developer tools, what it gives us is this ability to see the components. And I've just got one component here, but there's this top level component. But the thing about when we're writing apps, the one really important thing is that you have to think in components. So what I'm going to create is the way item, I'm going to call item row TSX, because the way that it optimizes the rendering, because if you've got one massive great component, it's going to have to render the whole thing and decide what's changed in the virtual DOM. Well, what's cool about the virtual DOM is that you can create these like child components, and these child components will basically allow us to decide on what needs to be rendered at the component level. Okay, so when we have a child component, we can say, well, actually, that child component doesn't need to be rendered. So I'm just going to keep the original, the existing DOM elements. Yeah, it's all good. But we might need to re-render another item. So it's to really have to get React working and to really understand what's going on. You need to understand when it's going to render. What prompts a render of a particular item. And that is really the key point about this virtual DOM, is understanding when a item is going to be rendered. So what I've done here is I've just put in a set of props. Props are read-only. That's really important. And I'm passing in an item, which means now if I go into the app, what I can do here is, rather than passing in just a normal link at a list item there, I can now say my item row like that. And because the props are read-only, they get passed down. So I can say item, and I can give it the item that is in this particular iterator. So I'm going to import that. Ding. Missing key. Look, you see there, missing key. It's always a good idea. Always be linting. Okay, there we go. So I can put the item in. It still needs that key because even though it's a child component, it still needs to be able to link it when it's rendering. So now what I've got is, if I save that and go back into my Chrome, now what I've got is, look, in the dev tools, is that a little bit small there? Can I make it a bit bigger? Yeah, I can. There we go. So item row. Look, you see, when I highlight it, it tells me where it is in the output. You know, that is really important. So dev tools are going to be brilliant to be able to decide on, you know, to be able to debug what's going on. But what it also does, it shows re-rendering. So the way in which something gets re-rendered is if a prop changes, or if a component state changes. So if I got some state at my app level here, this state here, I can change the state in this component. And because I'm passing the state down to the item row child component, it's being passed down as props. So when I change the state here, it will then change this item row and cause a re-render because I've changed the props. That's really, really fundamental, important to understand. So let's go and add in an add new kind of functionality to have like a simple button. So what I'm going to do is go and put in a function here to say how when they set the state, I'm going to add an item to the existing items and add it onto the end. So this is like this is a spread operator, and so what I'm doing is I'm saying set the state to be the existing items plus this item here. So it's doing it now. But what I'm using is this UUI, so I need to install that. So if I go and create a new node, so npm install like that, and then go back to my. That should gradually install, and I'm going to import. I think it's v4 as UUID from UUID. There we go. And it just basically creates a random unique identifier. Oh, I also need to install the types as well for it. So npm install types UUID. So when you're using TypeScript, you need the types as well as the actual library. Some libraries have got those types built in, but a lot of them don't. So when we do that, that should resolve once it's finished. So that's good. So now what we need to do is create like a button. So I've created a function here to kind of set the state, and the set the state will cause a mutation, and it cause a re-rendering. A little note: I'm using fat arrow here. Fat arrow is not the most performant, but for the purpose of doing this, you can use also the function.bind. But for the purpose of the demo, fat arrow is fine. But the key point of this is it kind of creates a little closure around here, and it allows us to have always use this, because if it didn't have the fat arrow, this wouldn't work. That's a very important concept. So I'm going to put like a button in here that will basically just allow us to add new. So I'm going to pop button, and I'm going to say on click equals, and I need to say it's called this dot, and I called it on add new. There we go, and there we go, add new. Okay, so let's go over. This is finished compiling. So we go here. This should, if I go back to my thingamajig, I click add new, and look, it's adding items. Boop boop boop, and there's my little unique IDs going in as my child items. But what you can see here is like the rendering. You can see that these little blue boxes. Now that is the React tools, the React tools for Chrome, giving us an indication when a component is rendered. So this is going to be really important when you start to create more complex components. It's always an idea, keep an idea on when this is happening. And at the moment, what it's doing is it's rendering the whole thing. Every single item is being added, even though I'm just adding one item. And the reason that is because there is a kind of a life cycle of a component, and it's a life cycle. It decides when the props have changed. It decides on. It looks at the old values and the new values and decides whether or not it needs to render. But by default, it's always going to render. It's always going to render it when that prop changes. And because I'm mutating the array, it decides on, okay, well my props have changed. But if I create something, if I use something called a pure component, what a pure component does is it says, okay, this component here it's going to automatically try and decide on if the items have mutated. It does a shallow comparison, but if I now go over to Chrome and add a new and refresh this, what it should do is, if I go over to item row, and I might need to create the index. What it's still doing is it's still actually mutating the whole lot. Okay, so because what it's deciding here is it's saying, well, actually, it's the item I'm passing in. So this is when you look at what you decide to pass as your props. What it's really important to do is decide what the props are so that it can decide whether or not it's mutated or not. Now, at the moment, I'm passing in an object. So really what I need to do is pass in the actual individual items that I use that I'm going to decide on if have mutated. Because remember, a pure component is shallow. It's doing a shallow. It won't look at the child items of items. So if I put title here, and this is a string, then what I can do is I can pass this in and say, well, now my props are here. So I'm not going to use item. I'm going to use title like that. And then I'm just going to put the title as a string rather than the actual the object. And then if we go back into our app, notice it's showing red. What I need to do now is I need to say, well, actually, the title is title, because now this shallow comparison should be able to decide that actually it hasn't mutated. So, well, it's still re-rendering. However, it's showing the render back. However, if I go into my elements here and go into my sources, if I go and put a breakpoint on the render method, if you go into item row, there we go. So this is the little item row render. If I do a breakpoint, it's hit the new item, but it hasn't hit all of the other items. So it's only rendering the item that I've added in. It's not going to render all of the other items. And so this concept of determining whether or not a component has been as mutated or not is really fundamental to the way in which you start to decide on if it's being mutated or not. Because I can also add in a button to sort of change a value. And this is where it really becomes more important, because if I'm changing a value, I might say force update, and I don't want it to go and re-render all of my child components. I only want it to render the item that has changed. And so without this concept here, passing in the title, that shallow comparison won't work. So I'm going to do a button here to update an item here. And I'm going to say on update like that. I'm just going to update item. And so what it's doing here is it's saying, okay, get me just the first item and just mutate the title, give it the ISO string, and then doing a force update. So if I go back into my React app, and there we go. So if I now do update, if I go to the render, this will now only break on the item that I have mutated, and that is going to always be the thing that you want to keep an eye on, is that when you are changing the props, it will always cause a sub-render, and always use these React tools to then go and decide on, and you can breakpoint on them and decide on whether or not the child item has actually been changed based on those props that are being passed down. So that's a kind of like, you know, a real short history of the virtual DOM. So that when the props change, it gets passed down, and you can use set state. And what happens is then it marks them all as dirty, and then it decides, okay, to do a render, and then it will update the real DOM. And so the key property is always going to be important to understand, because otherwise it can't decide on which item has moved in an array. So you have to have that key so it can mark them. So, you know, summary, it's the real DOM is kind of slow to change. It's not that slow when you're adding items, but to change it and repaint it in the browser, it's slow. So it allows us to do that. And pure component does that shallow comparison of props. So number 2, when does PCF need to call render? Because if you're doing PCF component development, then obviously it's going to be important to understand when you need to call that render, because if you've probably seen in other sessions, there's an init method in a PCF component, and there's an update view method. So when do you need to actually call that? Well, let's kind of simulate this. Let's simulate the PCF kind of mechanism. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a button here. So I'm just going to go create an element and button. Now you can see this is the sort of thing you'd be doing if you weren't using React, which is like, you know, it really shows you how much of a beautiful thing React is, you know, because to go and create stuff in the real DOM is quite tedious, whereas it's going to be much more efficient to create that React DOM. And so I'm just going to go and append this node here to the root. And I'm going to add this render button in. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put like a little function here around render, and it's not going to return anything, and it will do that virtual DOM. So I'm going to on click of that render button. So render button on click. I'm going to give it use fat arrow to create a closure around it, and so also let's just render it as well. So when we first start, so this would be kind of like the PCF init here, and then this would be kind of like the PCF update view, you know, because that's effectively what we're simulating here. So if we go back into here, let's get rid of that there, and so I can refresh that. So it's running the init first, and so it renders it to start off with. You know, we could go and do a breakpoint in the source on the index here. So it's going to call render when I refresh. That's the first render, and that would be when my PCF component's loaded. But when I click update view, you can see there it's doing a full re-render. So what we're doing is we're kind of forcing it to re-render. And we only want to force it to re-render if the props have changed. So when you're looking at your PCF component, it's important to say, if anything that's bound to my props that I'm passing down into my React elements have changed, that's when you need to call render. You don't need to call render in any other time, because I can mutate state internally without calling render. So you see, I'm clicking add new, right? And it's not, it's not actually, I'm not calling render manually. So React is going to manage its own re-rendering whenever I mutate state, and therefore obviously it passes that state down as props, and therefore when the props have changed, it re-renders. So you don't actually, if say for example you're bound to something that you're never going to change from that's coming into your PCF control, then actually you need to call render on your initial init. You don't need to call render ever again, because React is going to manage that re-render. With exceptions like, maybe for example, you've got an update, you've got update layout, and you maybe need to sort of make some decisions based on the available space. But normally your layout is going to be like using flexboxes or Fluent UI stacks, where it'll automatically basically use CSS to do the responsive layout. But if you've got something that, like, in Power Apps, it kind of shows and hides the left-hand nav depending on the amount of width you've got. That's a kind of an example. That wouldn't tend to be done with CSS. That would be done by going, oh, well, I've got less than this amount of width, therefore I need to hide my menu. Therefore, the props are going to change. Therefore, I would need to call render. So that's why you need to make that a consideration. So that's when I need to call render. So you've got this kind of init render, and then you could update view if you've changed any of the props. But then inside React, it manages its own rendering, its own re-rendering using when the props or state have changed. Obviously, when you destroy, you've got to remove elements, and you've got to use the unmount component at node in React, and that will just tidy things up. So wrapper hell then. Well, the thing about wrapper hell is that if you're thinking about components, and there's this thing in React called like lifting state up, which is basically where you've got states managed in a child component, you might then find that actually you need to interact with that state in a sort of a sibling component, like a neighboring component. If you've got like a top level and then two childs, you might be originally managing your state in one of those childs, but then you need to actually mutate the state in a side state. And you can't do that because you can't mutate the state in another component. You can only mutate the state internally within a particular component. And so when you lift state up, you kind of lift it to the parent element, and then you pass it down as props. And so what this does is it kind of creates this sort of complexity. So you would set the state of the parent, but then you on an on change event, and then that would pass it down as props. And that's fine for like a simple kind of hierarchy. But if you start to get more and more components, you start to get this sort of like, well, I've got an on change event which passes up to another on change, which goes all the way to the top, and then that passes down as props, and it's like, oh. And that is basically called wrapper hell, and so it's very easy to get into that scenario. So the way around that is by using an MVVM pattern and use a view model. So basically, if you change the state in one of these child components, it just lets the view model know, and the view model now goes, oh, okay, I've got all these subscribers to my view model, so I'm just going to go and notify all these subscribers that they need to go and re-render. So using the view model in MVVM, there are many different ways of doing this. There's the React context has got a mechanism. There's something called Redux. There's something called MobX. I personally use MobX all the time. So it's going to start to really simplify the way in which you manage your state. So controlled vs uncontrolled. This is a really interesting one because we talked about state. So if I go into my my state down here. So at the moment in our child component, we have got no state. We've just got props. So we're told by the parent that it is basically going to change when those props change. But if I start to manage some state, I am going to be able to re-render this child component independently of the parent. So if I give it some item row state, spell it right, item row state. Goodness, it's just started to tip it down with rain. I don't know if you can hear that. That's really hammering you down. So, okay, so I create Boolean there. And so what I'm doing here is I'm going to say, right, this accepts my props and my state. So now what I can do is I can say in the constructor, I can actually set the initial state. So I know that what I'm going to do is I'm going to create in my item, I'm going to have another thing here called selected and a Boolean to say whether, like a checkbox to say if an item is selected. And so I'm going to sort of initially set the selected to say, so this state, because you always in the constructor, you also have to set that initial state. And I'm going to say props, the item selected equals true, like that. And so what that does is it's going to, oh, what's it complaining about here? Derive blah, blah, blah. Oh, yeah, I need a super call. There we go. Boop. That should get rid of it. There we go. And so I'm setting the initial state. But if I wanted to like add a checkbox to say if it's selected or not, well, you know, I can put in here a thing here called an input, and I'm going to give it a type input. If I can type checkbox, and I'm going to give it an on change, because when you start to, you know, this is a pattern again. You'll see it a lot of the time when you're doing React. It's like if you've got anything happening, you're going to have an on change to signal it. So we're going to call it on selected change, and I'm going to just close that off like that. Checkbox. So I need to now define my on selected change. So I'm not going to put any. I'm just going to put an empty function here for now, which is the signature of this. There we go. It just takes the element, so nothing else. That's all it is. So if I go back into my React app, okay, there we go. Ooh, and it's giving me saying cannot find change event on selected event. Okay, that probably means that it's need to import change event. Okay, control dot again. Control dot is your friend. Okay, and go back into Chrome. Okay, so now we've got these checkboxes. I can check them. That's all good. It's all good. But what these are uncontrolled, because what I'm doing is I'm managing the state inside the actual checkbox itself. I'm not managing the state inside React. And that causes all manner of issues if you're managing checkbox state inside the DOM, because as we talked about before, the whole thing about React is the virtual DOM. So it's like this state is outside of React's. So we have to, in our on change event, we'd have to sort of go and get like an unsafe reference to the DOM element that's created, and you know all these kind of things. And so actually what we do is we convert this to a controlled checkbox. So we'd say from the state, we can use the deconstructor to say selected and get this state. And so we can actually, select. It's called select, not selected. We'll go back and check that. So I can now actually define this to say checked equals select. That's going to bother me that it's not selected, but I haven't got enough time to fix it. So now if I go back, we've got an on change event and we're bound to select. So you might think, oh, okay, well, that means that's going to be fine. But if I go back into Chrome, if I check this now, nothing happens. I can't actually check this because now it's a controlled component. It's no longer managing state in the virtual DOM, in the real DOM. It's managing state in the virtual DOM, which means inside my event here, I need to go and mutate. So I can say this set state, and I want to say select, and I can grab the state from my element here. So checked. It should have a value, is it, or checked? What's the current? I think this is an event. So current, yeah, there we go. Current target. That current target will be a DOM element, and then I think we've got checked. There we go. If it's true. So what we're doing, and remember when we set the state, because this state is being handled internally within this component, we will re-render it. We're not modifying the props, because the props are read-only. We are modifying the state, and the state is used here. If this state was passed down to props of a child component, say we replace this component with a child component, we'd be using that state to be passing down to the props, and obviously that would cause the child component to re-render. So if I save that and go into here, we should be able to, oh, look, we can. Now, can you see that we're only getting the render of this item because I'm now mutating the state at this child level rather than the parent level. And so this is where you start to get the kind of the performance gains of React. And as long as you keep an eye on this, if we were to kind of we could pass an event up to the parent component. And if we use the parent component, then we could modify the state up there. But then what that would do is it would pass down as props to all of these items, and it would mutate the whole array. And then the whole array would mutate, and therefore we'd render all of the items. So where you manage your state is really important, and that's fundamentally how you can start to get to that point of the sort of the component, the hell, the component hell, where you start to not worry. You have to worry about where all the state is being changed, and that's why something like MobX is really important. So lastly, this is a real whistle-stop tour, isn't it? Function or class components. So you might, if you kind of do a lot of searching on the internet of like React, you'll see people doing function stuff as well as classes. Now, I've been writing class components in these so far. So I'm basically saying I'm importing React component or pure component, and so this render method. But what I can do is I get this very similar thing, which I could say item row function.tsx. And what I'm going to do there, I can just say export a function, and it's going to return JSX element. And what we're going to do here is we're going to just return a fragment like that. And what we'll do is put like, just foo in there or something like that. And we're going to call it item row function because that's the name of the component. So we need to import React, obviously. Ding. And so this originally function components were they would only be able to manage props. Okay, because I can actually give props. I can give props from here, and I can say, well, actually accepts the same props as item row props here. And give it a type item row props. Ding ding. So originally I could say props dot title like that. But as of React 16.89, I can't remember what it was, they introduced the ability to have state. So originally functions were great for like writing read-only, effectively, just quick React components, maybe which had uncontrolled elements in there, or just read-only with the props. But now you can actually use state as well. But if I go in my app here, I basically use them exactly the same as item row function. I need to give it a key in the same way as ID, but I need to give a unique key because we've already created a key there. And I'm going to exactly the same because it accepts the same props. Title ding that. Oh, I don't know what it imported there. Title. And I need to wrap this in a fragment because you can only have a JSX element can only have a single fragment as a root. Boom. And if I go into my Chrome, I should see now. There we go. Oh, look, I can see the item. Yeah, so it's output in there. And if I add a new one, it kind of it goes and adds a new item there. So if I have got my components in classes, then you could decide to write them as functions. I mean, at the moment, you can also use set state as well. So I can even say const counter, I don't know, set counter equals set state using these are called hooks, the React hooks. So I need to import React hook. Use state, it's not set state. And then, so what that does is it just defines state in exactly the same way as before, where I created a type. So actually now you can use state. There really isn't very much difference between using functions or components. It actually is exactly the same kind of concept. However, some people prefer functions, some people prefer components. I prefer class components. That's just my matter of preference. But there's a little bit of a difference between item row functions, because one thing about the function is because it's an entire function, the whole thing is a closure. So with a with a class component, then you will effectively not capture all the values. So in this item here, if I use prop titles, say in a timeout or something like that, because the function runs every time it renders, it will capture the value of that. Whereas in my render function, if I had a timeout, the props will change at the class level rather than at the function level. And so therefore the props will be different when my callback comes back. So that's to me, that's the only real fundamental difference between the two. So yeah, it's entirely up to your choice. I mean, I haven't really got any, I don't want to enforce a preference on you. Because I've come from the sort of the C# background, I prefer component functions. They both effectively get compiled very similarly. And there may be a marginal reduction in size for function components, but it's not gonna break the bank. So that's like we've gone through. Oh, there we go. 16.8, February 16. That's when functions came out with the ability to set state. And so yeah, that's a whistle stop tour of 5 items that really should be on your radar to go and investigate. There's a shameless plug here. I've got a new course coming out for professional PCF controls for model-driven apps. I'm going to give away a free copy of this course. There's over 16 hours of video. All you need to do is fill out your feedback form and put hashtag ProCode NoCode Unite in there, and I'll get all the people. And I'll pick one person at random. So if you want to, if you want a free copy of that, you'll need to follow follow Twitter or YouTube, so I can get in contact with you that way as well. So yeah, thank you. That we're like 2 minutes. So we can take some questions offline if you'd like, but I hope you've got something out of that. A huge amount to go through, so I apologize it was so quick, and I was doing a lot of coding, but hopefully you should have got a little bit about seeing me coding that, seeing the kind of the thought patterns that I was going through. So there we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, and it's good to have you. And now I think so all the PCF developers, once they saw these sessions, have to go back and then redo their PCF controls, I believe. So a lot of work for all the PCF developers out there. Go and refactor your code.
Just put the linter in, and it's Control-Shift-P, right? That's easy.
yeah. And prettier.
Oh yeah, and prettier. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I need a bit prettier, to be honest, but but unfortunately, it doesn't work for me.
Well.